Hello and a very warm welcome. You're looking at the title page of Venus and Adonis, a poem often overlooked by lovers of Shakespeare because it's not a play, but it is funny, it is warm, it is full of beautiful imagery, and it's an easy read. So I do urge anyone who loves Shakespeare who hasn't read this yet to do so. Published in 1593, and as we know, it is the first work of any literature to be subscribed by the name William Shakespeare, and you see it here underneath, a dedication to Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. It is called Venus and Adonis because it takes its story from the very short couple of paragraphs in Ovid's Metamorphoses about Venus and Adonis. Shakespeare, you'll remember, was a terrific lover and fan of Ovid. In fact, you see just beneath the title a Latin quotation. Even if you don't speak Latin, you can see very easily that it divides into two phrases separated by a colon. The first of these is Vilia miretur vulgus, which can be translated, let the rabble delight in trash. Vilia could be trash, small things, insignificant things, rubbish. Christopher Marlowe, a contemporary of Shakespeare, translates this line, let base conceited wits admire vile things. The second phrase begins mihi, which means to me. To me may golden Apollo serve full cups of Castalian water. To understand this, you need to know of the myth of the Castalian spring, and that was the water bubbling up from the earth, guarded over by the muses, which poets believed that if they drank the Castalian water, they would have divine inspiration and write immortal poetry. So what's being said here, to understand, I think, why Shakespeare puts this particular quotation here from the Ovid's Amores, you need to read the passage in question where Ovid uses it. Ovid is addressing himself to envy, and he is pushing back against his detractors. A few lines later, Ovid writes, I am the well-known singer of my own worthless ways. So Ovid confessed his life through his works. And not only that, at the end of Metamorphoses, he essentially turns into his works. He metamorphoses into his own works. So there's a huge mirror here for Shakespeare, the great lover of Ovid, who uses the word William Shakespeare, the pseudonym William Shakespeare, for the first time here, and is confessing his life through his works. I think if you were to translate these two lines very freely, but in the way that Shakespeare intends them, and to reflect the reason why he put them on this title page, you would say, let base wits take pleasure in tittle-tattle, while I dignify the matter in lofty Apollonian verse. Now, anyone who's read Shakespeare's sonnets, which are written about this time, will know that Shakespeare is embroiled in a terrible scandal. He calls it a vulgar scandal. He says his name has been blackened, and he's absolutely in a state saying that he has been made a motley to the view. People are all laughing at him. So let us assume then that that is why this Ovidian quotation is here, that he is going to put into lofty verse the matter which is being talked about and gossiped about and is causing him a great misery at this time. Now, is there any clue on this title page about what this awful scandal is about? The answer is yes, there is a clue. If you look directly above the word Venus, you see the face of a woman with a very rich headdress upon her and two peacocks on either side. These peacocks actually give away her identity. She is, of course, a Juno. There's another picture of her with a crown on this time and two peacocks. And she is the Roman goddess of riches, relevant, of fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. So that might suggest that we've got here a poem which is about some contemporary gossip which is concerned with riches, fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. Can we, by turning the page, find any form of corroboration or any sense of who might be involved in this scandal? As I said, we have here a dedication letter signed from William Shakespeare to Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. Now, I'm not going to expend your time by reading it out and exploring, not even bothering to explore its surface meaning. I'll leave you to do that for yourselves. What we're interested in is double meanings, which are so rich in this period, and to see whether there's anything that might give a hint of a scandal about fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. If you look on the second line down, we have this word lines, unpolished lines. Lines in the OED, we know what they mean when they mean literally written lines, but they can also mean chiefly with reference to family descent, a series in which each member is the parent of the one next following. That's one of OED's definitions of lines. 2 lines later we get burthen. OED defines that as that which is born in the womb. 3 lines later he uses the word labour, the process of childbirth, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. The 9 beneath that we see heir, that which is begotten, offspring, Oxford English Dictionary. On the 9 beneath that we have the word ear, which is a wonderful book called Shakespeare's Bawdy, which has a glossary at the back of uses of words by Shakespeare in a sort of dirty context. And he uses the word ear to mean copulate. Ear, so barren a land. The word barren, again, the Oxford English Dictionary defines that of women bearing no children. So you can see that he's picking out from his vast vocabulary, William Shakespeare here, words which have a bearing on fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth, which also refers to the Juno, which is on the title page, on the headpiece of the title page, connects to that. Okay, just look at this extraordinary sentence here. But if the first heir of my invention prove deformed, funnily enough, Shakespeare used the word deformed to mean pregnant, though I don't think that's how it's intended here. If the first heir of my invention prove deformed, I shall be sorry it had so noble a godfather. So Shakespeare is calling Henry Rosalie, the Earl of Southampton, godfather to his first heir, to the poet's first heir, and he calls it the first heir of my invention. Not a normal heir. In other words, the idea that it might be somehow a surrogated heir. And then we have to look at the meaning of the word godfather. We all know it means a sponsor who turns up at the baptism, but may it not also mean the natural father known only to God? So this idea that Henry Rosalie actually served as a surrogate father to William Shakespeare's child, the Earl of Oxford's child. Let's have a look at the last 4 words of this dedication. The world's hopeful expectation. Now, if you were to go back in time, if you could, and find some intelligent, learned people of 1593, 1594, and ask them the question, what is meant by the world's hopeful expectation? They would all answer to a man, and we know what that means. It's the coming of Christ, the Son of God, the Son of Man. In other words, it is the coming of the Son. So he is using here a biblical scriptural reference to talk about an expected son. Now he does exactly the same thing in the next dedication. You can see straight away, this is the dedication to Lucrece, which was published the year following Venus and Adonis, and once again, exactly the same format. We have it signed William Shakespeare and addressed to Henry Rosalie, Earl of Southampton, so straight away you can see that these 2 dedications are designed as a pair. So you'll remember that the Venus one ends with an allusion to the coming sun, a spiritual allusion to the coming sun. And this one begins, the love I dedicate to your lordship is without end, whereof this pamphlet, without beginning, is but a superfluous moiety. Moiety means a share or a part. So again, I would ask you, if you were to be able to go back to the learned people of 1594 and say, what does this mean? What is it meant? Love without beginning and without end. They would say, oh, we know exactly what that means. And of course they do. It's a reference to the eternal love of the Father for the Son. So the Venus dedication ends with a scriptural allusion to the coming Son, and the Lucrece dedication begins with an allusion to the eternal love of the Father for the Son. So already we've gathered, we haven't even started reading the poem yet, but already we can understand just from the first 2 pages and the dedication to Lucrece that there is some gossip going on in the court of England in 1593, 1594. It involves the Earl of Southampton, and it involves this poet, William Shakespeare, and it involves a son and the surrogacy of a son. You'll notice here we have some of the same ideas that we had in the Venus dedication. My untutored lines, he says. Well, as we've just seen, yes, lines can mean written poetry, and that's the surface meaning, but lines can also mean my descendants, my untutored descendants, means the baby that is supposedly my son, who I have yet to educate, to school, to groom, to tutor. Now, try and imagine yourself, if you can, as the Earl of Oxford, who was long looking forward to getting an heir to the Earldom of Oxford and couldn't, and got his young friend, the Earl of Southampton, to surrogate an heir with his mistress, Lady Penelope Rich, and you want to thank him, but you want to thank him in a way that it's not absolutely obvious what you mean. But would you not write something precisely like this? What I have done is yours, what I have to do is yours, being part in all I have devoted yours. Were my worth greater, my duty would show greater. Meantime, as it is bound to your lordship. And then, of course, he signs off your lordships in all duty. Now, Oxfordians are used to Stratfordianists saying, well, hang on. Obviously, the Earl of Oxford couldn't have written this dedication even under a pseudonym, because he is addressing the Earl of Southampton, who comes lower than he does in the order of social precedence, and yet he's talking of owing and being bound to him in duty. This is surely the language of a servant. Well, yes, that's the surface meaning, and that's intended as a surface meaning. But now you understand that the Earl of Oxford now has a baby who is the natural son of the Earl of Southampton, who he is going to bring up as his own. You understand this reference to the duty to which he is bound to the Earl of Southampton. I hope that is very clear, and we obviously, just by reading the sonnets, know that the Earl of Southampton is indeed part of the great scandal. If you look at Sonnet 34, for instance, the reader discovers that the fair youth, and this is Southampton in the sonnets, suffers shame and has repented his ill deeds, for which the poet somehow bears a responsibility. The fair youth is blamed and slandered in Sonnet 70 by people passing lascivious comments on his wantonness. Those who have seen my upload on William Covell, who knows perfectly well what this scandal is all about, and he identifies the Earl of Southampton as wanton Adonis. The disgrace to both the poet, Shakespeare, in the sonnets, and to the fair youth is such that the poet proposes that he and the youth be no longer seen together, insisting that he, i.e. the poet, should shoulder the blame and thus protect the youth from further ignominy. You'll find this in Sonnet 36. So, once again, what you're seeing here is, if you want to put it crudely and rudely and derogatorily, you're seeing Shakespeare is washing his dirty linen in public. I've brought up here a picture of a cuttlefish which is spraying its black ink all over the place to hide itself. This is what cuttlefish do when they're frightened. They hide themselves in their own ink. Now, in the 1590s, a satirist called Joseph Hall attacked Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, the poet, and attacked him under the name of Labeo. He used the word Labeo because he was referring to a Roman nobleman who, according to Suetonius, wrote plays but passed them under the name of Terence, who was an African slave. So he was a concealed playwright. And Joseph Hall attacks Edward de Vere as Labeo, but calls him a cuttlefish. Long as the crafty cuttle lieth sure in the black cloud of his thick vomiture, who list complain of wronged faith or fame when he may shift it on to another's name. What he's saying is that, yes, okay, you're washing your dirty linen in public, but it doesn't count because you're putting it under a false name, that name obviously being William Shakespeare. So Joseph Hall is trying to accuse Oxford of being somewhat cowardly, but of course that's not correct. What Oxford is doing is actually being extremely brave and extremely self-effacing, like Ovid, who describes himself as the well-known singer of his own worthless ways. So Oxford is erasing his identity and singing, if you like, putting into poetry his own worthless ways. Okay, so this scandal, which concerns the Earl of Oxford encouraging Southampton and his mistress Penelope Rich to surrogate an heir for him, I have already put 5 presentations down onto this channel about it, showing how contemporaries were aware of it. I would hope that those who are really interested in this will look at these. Those are the names of them. I won't read them out. The only thing is to say that in number 2 deals with William Covell and his knowledge of this scandal, and he identifies the Earl of Southampton as wanton Adonis. In number 4, John Weaver also identifies Southampton as Adonis in the Shakespeare poem, and also Penelope Rich as Venus. So it's quite useful to look at those for corroborating evidence. Number 5, the last one there, is the only piece of evidence I've been able to find that shows how Edward de Vere was able to justify his actions according to biblical exegesis, and I suspect that it was John Dee who showed him this and said, yes, well, it's not good to tell a lie, but what you're actually doing, surrogating this heir, is okayed, if you like, by the scriptures, by something in the Gospel of Matthew. But have a look at those if you're interested. Let me, for now, just give a tiny bit of historical background to this scandal. Penelope Rich was married in her late teens to something of an oaf and a parvenu called Robert Rich. As his name implies, he was indeed a very rich man and a bit of a social climber and a bit of a bully and a braggart, and he didn't like her. She didn't like him very much, though she was a good wife in some ways to him. She bore him 5 children, 2 daughters, Lettice, the second was called Essex after her brother was Earl of Essex, of course, and her father, was Earl of Essex, and Robert, their first heir, Elizabeth and Henry. Even before Henry was born, Penelope Rich was having an affair with another courtier called Charles Blount. Charles Blount was, on the death of his brother, became Lord Mountjoy and was made by James I was made Earl of Devonshire. And he underwent a sort of weird marriage with Penelope Rich. I say weird because it was hotly contested and the divorce laws weren't the same as they are now, and it was believed to be a dud marriage. But even before that marriage took place on the 26th of December 1605, Penelope Rich had by him, out of wedlock, various children and a pregnancy that resulted in a miscarriage. Now, if you look at this list of Penelope Rich's pregnancies and children, you'll see that she becomes pregnant once every year or every other year, consistently from 1583 all the way to 1600, but for one really significant looking gap right in the middle, and that's after the birth of Henry by Lord Rich, who was born in August 1590, and before she has a miscarriage in May 1594, one assumes, by Charles Blount. So that's a 4-year gap, which is highly unusual, actually, if you were to do a study of women who have many, many children. You don't have a gap without a reason. She's obviously very fertile, hence there's a little connection to Juno, who is the goddess of fertility, and Rich is clearly the goddess of Penelope Rich, one should have thought. So this 4-year gap, and this is the 4 years in which we find the publication of Venus and Adonis, the poem, and also the publication of Lucrece. And you notice just from those 2 badly produced title pages that both of them have the headpiece with Juno in it. Juno, the goddess of fertility and riches. Lucrece, of course, is synonymous with rich. Lucrece means rich, and Lucas means riches. So there's a connection there. So these two poems coming out about this scandal, and of course at exactly the same time we have this great badinage from the other poets, all coming out and having their poetic point to say about this scandal. Many of them decrying Southampton as a narcissist. Certainly he's a narcissist in the Delia sonnets, and he's a narcissist in Piers Gaveston, and he's a narcissist in Venus and Adonis. Okay, in this space of time when all these poems are coming out, we also have the birth of a certain Henry Vere. He's born in February 1593, and he has jet black eyes, just as his mother does, this jet black eyes, Penelope Rich. And he has many features in common with his natural father, the Earl of Southampton. Okay, so back to the poem, which seems to be wrestling with this contemporary gossip. Here you see a picture by Titian. This was actually in Titian's studio in 1575 when Oxford was in Venice, and a late, rather brilliant Oxfordian scholar, Naomi Magri, has written about this picture, saying that Oxford must have seen it because it appears that Shakespeare in Venus and Adonis actually describes very precisely this picture, which obviously William Shakespeare of Stratford could never have seen, since it was sitting in Venice when Oxford was in Venice. It shows a moment in the story when Adonis is being persuaded by Venus not to go off hunting, but to stay with her, loving her. How to find out in what ways Shakespeare is reusing Ovid's story to talk about his own scandal, the easiest way to do that is to see which parts of the Shakespeare story are invented, that are not drawn from Ovid. In Shakespeare, we find an Adonis who is rather reluctant to sleep with Venus. In Ovid, that's not the case. He's the lover of Venus, and that's that. But here he's rather reluctant to do it. He needs a lot of persuading. You'll remember in Shakespeare's sonnets, the 17 sonnets, persuading the fair youth to have a baby for love of me. Otherwise your beauty will die. This is another aspect of both the sonnets and Venus and Adonis that do not occur in the Ovid story. Both times he is accused of being a narcissist, and both times he is told that if you don't have a baby, your beauty will die. So we need to look at those things quite clearly. There's a wonderful moment in the Shakespeare story when Venus gets so tired out of trying to persuade Adonis to kiss her that she does a mock faint and lies down on the grass pretending to be unconscious. And then Adonis, he wrings her nose, he strikes her on the cheeks, he bends her fingers, holds her pulses hard. He chafes her lips, 1,000 ways he seeks to mend the hurt that his unkindness marred. He kisses her, and she by her good will never rise, so he kiss her still. She eventually awakes from this extraordinary ecstasy, thinking she's in heaven. Her eyes and his are together mixed. So there's a lot of sort of subliminal sense that they've actually had sexual intercourse in this moment. I'll leave you to read it for yourselves. It's lines 450 roughly to 520. Have a look at it. And of course, eventually what happens is Adonis does break away from Venus's clutches, both in the poem and in Ovid, and goes off hunting. And a wild boar gores him in the balls, fundamentally. If you look at Oxford's uncle's translation of Ovid's Venus and Adonis, he says he's gored in the cods. Shakespeare himself says, "Thus was Adonis slain, the loving swine sheathed unaware the tusk in his soft groin." Very interesting way of putting this. He's calling the swine, the boar, a loving swine, and he's unaware, he's sinking his tusk into Adonis's organs, the organs of generation, the organs from which he is able to have a child. Interesting the way he's putting that. Now, it's called Venus and Adonis, this poem. One is maybe fair to assume there are two characters in it, Venus and Adonis. Actually, there are three characters in this poem. And the third character is the boar himself, who treats Adonis, the loving swine. The boar, as many will know, is the crest, the great insignia, of course, of the Earl of Oxford. So I've shown in previous uploads how Venus is recognized as Penelope Rich, how Adonis is Rosalie, Earl of Southampton, and I'm now saying that what is happening here also is that the third character is Oxford himself, symbolized by the boar, which indeed was the cognizance, the badge, and the crest of the Earl of Oxford. So he's definitely identified as Oxford. Actually, if you were to be a real pedant and a bore, and knowing how much Renaissance poets are obsessed by numbers, if you bother to count the numbers of times the word boar occurs in the poem Venus and Adonis, you'll find, well, yes, it occurs 17 times, and there's a reason for that, because it is pointing out that the boar is representing the 17th Earl of Oxford. I've put down below the portrait of Oxford there his signature, where you can see that he very cleverly uses the stem of the D and the O of Oxford to get 10 and 7 dashes beneath it. That's 17. And then that funny squiggle above there, which serves as a coronet with the raised pearls, meaning he's an earl. But also, if you look at it very carefully, it incorporates the word nil with 2 V's. So it's vero nihil verius, nothing truer than the truth, is also incorporated in that clever little squiggle. So 17th Earl of Oxford. Okay, so Oxford is, if you like, the boar, and the boar then somehow goads or prods the gonads, for want of any better word, the generative organs of Adonis, and the blood spills out of Adonis, and from the blood grows a flower. Now, if you read your Ovid, he says, your blood, this is Venus talking to the deceased Adonis, your blood will be changed into a flower. So saying, she sprinkled the blood with odorous nectar, and at the touch it swelled up as bubbles emerge in yellow mud. In less than an hour, a flower of the colour of blood was created, but enjoyment of it is brief, for lightly clinging and too easily fallen, the winds deflower it, which are otherwise responsible for its name, windflower or anemone. So it's a famous fact that the flower that grows out of Adonis's spilt blood from his generative organs is an anemone. Everybody knew that. If you look at the old books of flowers, you'll find of anemone or windflower, the poet's fable that it grew from Adonis' blood, hence they call it Adonis his flower. Now we go to the Shakespeare poem, and he writes at the very end, by this the boy that by her side lay killed was melted like a vapour from her sight, and in his blood that on the ground lay spilled, a purple flower sprung up, checkered with white. Now, Shakespeare is a very learned writer. He knows perfectly well that everybody else knows that the anemone is the flower that should be here, and he's gone and changed it. He's changed it to a purple flower, sprung up, checkered with white. Well, there only is one flower of that description, as any botanist will tell you, and that is what we now call the snake's head fritillary. Now we have to ask, what was Shakespeare playing at? Why did he change the identity of this flower? What does this flower symbolize that might have some bearing on this underlying commentary he's given about his own scandal? To understand this, I think first of all we need to look of how Venus in the poem, Shakespeare's poem, how she treats this flower. So as you remember, it grows up from the spilt blood from Adonis' groin. She bows her head, the new sprung flower, to smell, comparing it to her Adonis' breath, and says within her bosom it shall dwell. Poor flower, quoth she, this was thy father's guise. So she's now addressing the flower, talking about its father. Here was thy father's bed, here in my breast thou art the next of blood, and 'tis thy right. Lo, in this hollow cradle take thy rest, my throbbing heart shall rock thee day and night. There shall not be 1 minute in an hour wherein I will not kiss my sweet love's flower. So what do we see here? We see that Venus is treating this flower that grew out of the blood spilt from the groin of Adonis. She is treating this flower as though she were a mother treating a newborn baby. She takes it to her breast. She rocks it, she cradles it, she smells it, she addresses it about her father. So, in other words, it looks as though this flower is some sort of symbol of this surrogated baby. And if that is the case, let us see how it works. If we go to John Gerard's famous book, Herbal, of 1597, so it's more or less contemporary, we see that this flower, this snake's head fritillary, has its own chapter, and there's a part of it where he discusses the names of it. He says, the Guinea Hen Flower, and I'll come to that meaning in just a second. The Guinea Hen Flower is called by Dodoens, the famous botanist, Flos meleagris. Flos meleagris means just that, Guinea Hen Flower, meleagris being the guinea hen in Latin, the Latin name, Flos meleagris. Lobelius, who's another famous botanist, calls it the Narcissus lily, Lilio Narcissus variegate, for that it hath the flower of a lily and the root of Narcissus. Now, we've seen time and again how the Earl of Southampton is identified as Narcissus. In fact, he has a whole poem dedicated to him called Narcissus by a man called Clapham. And time and again we find the contemporaries, including Shakespeare, when he's talking of him as the fair youth, and Venus and Adonis, including Michael Drayton and others, who refer to Southampton as Narcissus. So this, in a way, connects Henry Roseley, the Earl of Narcissus, the Earl of Southampton, to this flower, this Narcissus lily. If we go back to Gerard's book, we see that the main title for this flower is the turkey hen flower, or the Guinea hen flower. He also calls it checkered daffodil. But as I say, the turkey hen and the guinea hen are names for what we now call the guinea fowl, and it's pretty obvious why this flower should be called after a guinea fowl. If you look at that, it has the same sort of checked, almost purple and white dots. Here you see 12 things I wish someone had told me about the guinea fowl, or the turkey hen. Well, I'm about to tell you one of those things. Maybe you wish you had known earlier. If you look it up in old dictionaries, we look up turkey hen. It means Penelope. In fact, if you go to early books about Penelope, the mythical character, she was first called Arnea, but afterwards she was called Penelope from the guineas or turkey hens named Meleagris and Penelopes. So in other words, Penelope is another name for the turkey hen. So this is called the turkey hen flower, and therefore that would be synonymous where you could call it a Penelope flower. And that very clearly connects us to Penelope Rich. So it does indeed look now as though this surrogated heir is a symbol for the child, the natural child of Southampton, the great Narcissus and Penelope Rich. I should also perhaps remind those not from England who don't know this very, very rare flower indeed, but here it is growing in enormous profusion in the meadows of Oxford, in Magdalen College meadows and in Iffley meadows, and it is now absolutely recognised as the iconic flower of Oxford. Great historian and botanist Mark Griffiths has written about the Magdalen Oxford meadows. This ancient sward hosts one of the last great populations of the snake's head fritillary, Fritillaria meleagris. As I said, that's the guinea hen fritillary, now believed to be the westernmost and stranded relics of a wider continental population. So a very ancient population of this very rare flower in Oxford. However, Mark Griffiths later writes elsewhere, in the late 16th century it was highly prized in England as an imported horticultural novelty. So he hasn't quite made up his mind, and I don't think anybody actually knows. Certainly some variations of this flower were imported, but how did it get in this huge profusion into Oxford? Is there any connection to Venus and Adonis and this flower? But like it or not, however you try and cut this, we know that this flower, this particular flower, is the iconic flower of Oxford. And that, of course, links us to Edward de Vere, who is the Earl of Oxford, and most particularly it links us to this baby, this son who was born, Henry Vere, who became Earl of Oxford, had no business to be Earl of Oxford because he was the natural son of Henry Roseley, Narcissus Lily, and Penelope, the Penelope flower. So I hope you've understood and got this, and I hope in some ways you can stand in awe of the absolutely exceptional use of symbolism by the Tudor mind, and most particularly, of course, by Shakespeare, that he can take this single object, this single beautiful flower, and in one line reveal the true story of a rather complicated matter, which the gossips of the time were marvelling in, maybe disgusted about, but which Shakespeare had decided that he would set in lofty Apollonian verse. Thank you very much for staying with me to the end. Please inspire your friends to look at this and to follow others of my uploads by pressing the subscribe and the bell button, so you'll always know when there's something new coming your way. Thank you for watching.